you've also written about whether Jesus was a socialist. So I'd like to ask you about that. And then also, I'd like to sort of go on to I don't know if you saw the recent controversy around Dave Ramsey's comments. You know, Dave Ramsey, the esteemed financial commentator
I know
in the
him.
US.
Yes, although I may not be aware of recent comments that you're bringing up.
Okay. Well, essentially what he argued was that someone asked him a question: as a Christian, should I feel bad if I raise the rent on my properties to the market rent, and then that means that some of my tenants can't afford to live in those properties anymore, or it causes them financial hardship? And Dave Ramsey got into, well, he caused a bit of his comments. They weren't well received by many, particularly on the progressive side of politics, because he said, "Oh, look, there's no problem with doing that because it's not me that is evicting you; it's actually the market." And he was appealing to the market. So yeah, I'd like to ask you about that. If you ever, given you haven't seen his comments, and you may, it's probably worthwhile considering the whole context of them. Feel free not to sort of comment on that. But I would like to ask you about your work on, was Jesus a socialist? Could you just take us through what your analysis of that question has revealed, please, Larry?
I'd be happy to, Gene. In fact, maybe the best way to begin that is to actually tell a story from the New Testament that answers your first question.
Okay.
I think along the lines of what Dave Ramsey apparently said. Jesus himself told nearly 40 parables, and most of them deal with things like eschatology and salvation and so forth, but at least 3 of them have very strong economic content. One of them that's relevant to what you've just raised is the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And this is about a man who apparently owns a substantial vineyard, and he needs to bring the grapes in. It's harvest time. And Jesus tells the story of how he gets a group of workers together first thing in the morning, and he says, "I'll give you each a denarius for a full day's work." And they say, "Okay." So they go out and they start picking grapes, and then around noontime, the owner realizes, "Wow, I've got to get even more out there." So he gets another group together and he says, "Look, I know the day's half gone, but if you'll go out for the rest of the day and pick grapes, I'll give you each a denarius." And then finally, at the end of the day, with maybe an hour before dark, and he still has grapes that have to come in, he calls another group of workers and says, "If you'll take time out, go out for an hour and pick some grapes, I'll give you a denarius." And then later, according to the story, the owner gathers all these 3 groups of workers together to pay them. And the first group, of course, is very angry because they're saying, "What? We worked a full day and you're giving us the same as those guys who showed up at the, later, even the ones that only worked for an hour?" And you would think that if Jesus were a socialist, he would have the vineyard owner saying, "Oh, you're right, this is unfair, I'm sorry about that, blah, 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 blah." But instead, Jesus has the vineyard owner say to these guys, "It's my money. You signed the contract. I'm giving you what I promised. Now take it and get out of here." I mean, that's Jesus basically saying private property, voluntary contract, keeping your word, honest dealings, and I think supply and demand all defend what the vineyard owner is saying. Presumably, he had to pay that last group of workers a hefty premium to get. They probably worked for somebody else all day, and now they're being asked to go out for yet another hour. He has to pay them a premium to do that, to bring the grapes in. Jesus does not say, "Oh, well, let's be compassionate and give this group the same as that group, or in proportion to their time." Instead, he says, each man is getting what he was promised, what he agreed to by contract. So I think Dave Ramsey is essentially right. There is no obligation, moral or otherwise, for someone to endure a loss or to get less than he could for property that's his, when market conditions suggest that a higher rent is warranted. It's the higher rent that will likely bring more housing units into the marketplace, which will solve the problem in the long run anyway.
Right. Yep. Okay. By inducing more supply, more investment
Yes.
in rental properties. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Okay. Well, I'll put a link to the article on Dave Ramsey. I thought it was a fascinating discussion, and also, yeah, I'll find something. I'll have to link to that. Was it a parable? Was it?
Yeah, the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And I discussed that in more detail in my book, Was Jesus a Socialist? If anybody cares to look at it from that perspective.